So yes, my name is Greg Yudin. I'm a political philosopher, currently based at Princeton. And yes, I'm pleased to introduce Mirko Canevaro, who is professor of Greek history at the University of Edinburgh and studies Hellenic political institutions and political thought. And what connects Mirko and me, I guess, is our shared interest in democratic theory and democratic institutions, which we will explore today in relation to David's essay. Mirko, many thanks for accepting the invitation, for joining me. Really great to have you.
Thank you for having me. I'm really pleased to be here and very excited.
Yeah, well, before we dive in, I'd like to offer a few remarks just to set the stage for this conversation. Some of you might know me, as Nika mentioned, as the translator of David's bullshit jobs into Russian. But and yes, I indeed met David even before that. He was a great inspiration for my own field project on debt. We met first time in Cambridge, I guess, at a conference on debt. But my primary field is theory of democracy. And this piece that will appear in this edited collection as There Never Was a West resonated with me for two reasons. First, as someone who works on the history of concepts, I've often thought it would be valuable, to write at some point a history of the most harmful political concepts, the worst of the worst. And the concept of the West would certainly play a central role in such a project. In fact, it might be the single most harmful idea in contemporary politics. Why? Well, because it creates a false sense of, homogeneity within this so-called Western world, and simultaneously exaggerates the differences between the West and the rest. And this has damaging consequences, particularly in countries like my own, Russia, where attempts to emulate this completely illusory Western ideal lead to total desperation, cynicism, nihilism, and rejection of any kind of utopian vision. David, I guess, might argue that these failures, they lead us directly into the dead zones of imagination. And since the logic is that since we already tried to be Western and failed, we are left with the temptation to abandon hopes of imagining and building a better society. This is at least the dominant mindset in Russia and I guess in many other places as well. That was the first reason. And the second reason why this piece struck me is because of David's criticism of the hegemonic view of democracy, which equates democracy with elections or more generally with majority voting. And indeed, I guess if you ask a random person on the street what democracy means, they will likely tell it's about fair and free elections. And if you want more democracy, well, then simply let people vote on every issue directly. This is actually a strange view, especially when we take the history of democracy seriously. Since antiquity, elections have been seen as an oligarchic institution, not as a democratic institution. And as Graeber concludes, quote, the result are not democracies in any meaningful sense of the word, but republics with a few, usually fairly limited democratic elements, end quote. So this is where we are. And now Graeber makes a link between these two ambitious claims, one about the West, one about democracy, by questioning the relevance of the Athenian experience to democratic practices. He notes, correctly I think, that the connection that is often drawn between today's popular vote and ancient Athens as birthplace of democracy is largely invented and fundamentally distorts the Athenian experience. But he also argues, and this to me is a more contentious claim, that Athenian democracy was majoritarian and that it reflected the balance of armed power. Quote, if the vote was 60-40, everyone could see the balance of forces and what would happen if things actually came to blows. Every vote was, in a real sense, a conquest, end quote. So is this an accurate picture? Is it true that today's democracy has nothing to learn from Athens and we should abandon the idea of reclaiming this tradition? Now, there is an ongoing debate among political theorists and historians about how decisions were actually made in Athens. A very vibrant debate, I would say. And Mirko is a key figure in this debate, and I take it that his view of democracy shares some similarities with Graeber's. So, Mirko, at this point, I would like to ask you to tell us, what do you think is at stake in this debate about the relevance of Athenian democracy? And what do you think Graeber got right, or what did he get wrong?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks, Greg. So I should probably... So I think Graeber got a lot of things right. In fact, he got a lot of things right about Athenian democracy that he did not attribute to Athenian democracy, as a matter of fact. So it is a fact that Athens has been part of what has configured itself until the late 19th century as the Western imagination, but certainly has been part of a European imagination from much earlier. The interesting thing about what job Athens has done in the building of the kind of Western political canon is that for a very, very long time, Athens was an anti-model. Nobody was really kind of using Athens as a good model. Athens was associated by people that mostly read Plato and Aristotle with mob rule and with everything that is undesirable about forms of popular control, assembly politics, and the like. Certainly in the English-speaking world, the main point of access to Athens for a few centuries was Thomas Hobbes' translation. And Zoom just asked me to confirm my speaking language, and is guessing that it must be Japanese, which means that I'm doing obviously a great job with my accent tonight. My apologies, but I have saved English now, so right, back here. Okay, so Athens was certainly a model for nobody. Can you hear me now? Yeah, all good. So Athens was certainly a model for nobody. In a funny way, much of the anti-democratic tradition and the republican tradition well into the 18th century and the early 19th century didn't like Athens, liked Rome, liked models of mixed constitution. When Athens started being liked, the way it was liked, mainly through the work of somebody like George Grote and the utilitarian circles in England, was more or less by neutralizing, at least to some extent, its more antagonistic drives. Athens became kind of a pacified antecedent for modern parliamentary democracies, and that's the way Athens became what some have called a model for democracy as a hooray world. And even to this day, therefore, Athenian democracy is considered to be different from modern democracy in very specific respects, because it's direct, because people don't have, at least most of the time, representatives. But apart from that, there is this line drawn. So Athens is majoritarian, Athens is elite controlled, Athens has a political class, Athens has some kind of centralized institution. In a funny way, I think Athens itself has been the victim of this assimilation within Western tradition. If you look at Athens, I'll talk very quickly about a few things that perhaps people don't know. So if you look at the evidence for Athens, when people talk about it, it is no surprise to know that the Athenians voted. They voted in the assembly. Of course, the Athenian assembly was a very big affair. In every session, there were at least 6,000 people present out of a citizen population of adult males, of course, in between 60 and 30,000, depending on periods of its history. Anyway, at least 6,000 were present. We know there was debate, but at some point they had to vote. The interesting thing is that if you look at histories of vote in Athens, everybody refers to one vote to make the argument about majority rule, which was the vote in the famous Mytilenean debate to first to enslave, to kill men, enslave women and children of a recalcitrant ally, and then the next day, with a split vote right in the middle, they revoked the decision they had made. Now, the funny thing is that that is the only majoritarian decision recorded for the Athenian Assembly in the whole of its record. We have plenty of other decisions recorded, and they are all unanimous. Not only that, this is true across the board. People concentrate on Athens, but Greek democracy was a much bigger affair than Athens. The Greek world, at the turn of the 4th century, had something in the region of 1,500 polis, city-states. By the end of the 4th century BC, most of these cities, the vast majority, was democratically governed. That is, there was no, although there were slaves and women did not participate, there was no census exclusion, no barrier in terms of socioeconomic background, and they had sovereign assemblies in which everybody could speak up and talk. Now we have thousands of inscriptions of decisions of these assemblies, tens of thousands, and we have hundreds of inscriptions that report the outcome of votes. Now, I tabulated this stuff, and over 95% of the decisions attested by these inscriptions are unanimous. And those that are not unanimous, as a matter of fact, are almost unanimous. I think the lower the more split they get is something like 80-20. So that's kind of the empirical stuff. And I read David Graeber's essay, the famous essay. I think I read it first in 2013 when it was translated into Italian. And it resonated with me because I had, although I'm a bit younger perhaps, I had similar experience in the alternative globalization movement and in Occupy. And I kind of got a similar experience of consensual deliberative assemblies or form of democratic politics. And that's kind of why I started looking into this stuff, and I was a bit surprised by what I was finding. And when I read the essay, I thought, you see, perhaps Athens has been kind of badly served by being assimilated to some extent into this Western tradition, whereas in fact is perhaps the best attested and one of the biggest, we'll talk about size later, example of the kind of democratic politics that Graeber discusses and is discussing even now. I could go on about this. There are many more things. One other point that I would like to make, and that's just to kind of demythologize the moment of the vote in Greek cities, in Greek democracies in general. I would just kind of make a point, which is a small philological point. If you look at decrees from Athens and from another 1,000 of cities from the Greek world, the standard formula that they use for a decision of the people, of the assembly, is this formula that is, in Greek, is dedochthai to demo, which is always translated as it has been decided by the demos. But technically, it means it has come to be the opinion of the demos. And it's got a processual element to it. And one thing we know is that the Athenians did not vote on a lot of stuff all the time. What they did was, on any given issue, they would talk it to death. And usually when they did come to a vote, that was on one single proposal. Even if there could be more, that was the one proposal on which they had essentially already kind of agreed through sustained discussion and so on. Once they had come to the opinion that facilitators, as we would call them today, that were selected by lot, and they were commoners, essentially. We can talk later about how come the commoners could just kind of run assemblies with 6,000 people. That's another element that I think is quite interesting. When they felt that an agreement had been reached, that a consensus had formed, which wasn't pure consensus in an Habermasian sense, it was something more contextual, more negotiated, more living in actual politics, it was thought of compromise or whatever, that's when a particular proposal will be put to the vote. And also there was a very strong institutionalized kind of power of veto. Anybody could raise his hand and say, I think this is illegal, I veto this. And then it couldn't be approved, and it would take months for this to be assessed by a law court. So just to point out that Athenian democracy is a bit different from the way histories of democracy painted sometimes.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so there was a question from Nika about Mytilenean dialogue that you mentioned, the famous case. I think yes, Stas has already attached a link, and I think we will need to attach a link to the recording of this video just to make it clear for the viewers. Well, I would probably have a couple of more questions, and then we will turn to Q&A. So basically, what you say means that this 60-40 example that David provides is quite a rare case in Athenian democracy. That just simply didn't work like that.
Yeah, there wasn't. I mean, that was actually. I don't think there is a 60-40 case. There is a 50% plus one, and then there are all 100% against nobody. Even the decision on the famous Sicilian expedition, which was preceded by one of the most contentious debates in the history of democracy that lasted ages, and people argued against each other to death, ended up with a unanimous vote.
Okay, so that's important. But now you mentioned these concepts of consensus. And clearly there were institutions that were working towards like building this consensus before the vote. So, and Graeber also clearly resists the idea that democracy is simply a majority imposing its will on minority. At one point, he formulates his own ideal of democratic legitimacy in this essay. I quote, "The point is to ensure that no one walks away feeling that their views have been totally ignored, and therefore that even those who think their group came to a bad decision are willing to offer their passive acquiescence." So that sounds quite Hegelian to me. Freedom as compliance with self-imposed limitations.
Yes.
Now, my question is, how does this ideal work in a situation of intense class conflict?
Yeah.
How consensus can be compatible with those sharp class divisions? Because Athens was clearly a class-based society. There were classes, and one definition of democracy, of Athenian democracy, is actually the rule of the poor, where demos means the poor, a regime where the poor sort of systematically dominate the rich.
Yeah.
Sounds good to us poor, but the rich will probably feel a little bit oppressed. So should we as Democrats aim for a classless society, or how does that work in a class-based society?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I should say that, like, one of the reasons for which... Okay, there is, like, that's another kind of element of tension in modern narratives of Athenian democracy, no? If you ask most scholars of Athenian democracy and most political theorists of a pro-democratic leaning, what does demokratia means and what specifically means demos means in the word demokratia, they will tell you that it means the totality of the citizens, of the people, and not a class-based group. And in fact, by and large, I wouldn't say the orthodoxy, but the most widespread opinion about this is that there are two opposing definitions of demokratia in ancient sources. One of them is the democratic one, which is democracy is the power of all, of the demos as all. And the other is the anti-democratic one, the one by the elites, for whom democracy is the power of the poor. And then you got Aristotle that says something like, democracy is the power of all, but of course, if everybody has an equal say, because the poor are more numerous, then it's the power of the poor, which is his kind of way to say it. I think that also is a bit of a misunderstanding. In a funny way, like, you can see a lot of kind of democratic discourse, particularly in certain inscriptions, in certain texts, that does oscillate between the demos being all and the demos being the masses, the poor. In fact, we could even say the working classes, because the elite definition of what the demos was the poor were, what the poor were, was those that had to work for a living. So that the working element was really the central one. Now, the impression you get, and I get to the problem about class-ridden society and about consensus and how that works, is that in Athenian democracy, you find that there is, at various points, and certainly in the 5th and 4th century, something of an hegemonic popular discourse, and even kind of an hegemonic popular culture. The forms that are institutionalized are fundamentally those of the common people, which means that cultural forms that are more associated with the elite are normally considered extra-official and potentially subversive. Even like the kind of place where these people meet together and go for a drink at some point gets outlawed, because it's the kind of place where they think about how to overturn the democracy, no? Which means that rich people can belong to the demos to the extent that more or less they align themselves with the demos and with this kind of hegemony, and also to the extent that they don't protest to being taxed and squeezed to a very considerable extent. In Athens, the only form of direct taxation that existed was only on the top 4% richest people in the city. Nobody else paid direct taxes. And this is where, for example, I think David Graeber, in the way he talks about consensus, which comes from experience of political activism and of actual practice, gets something that much talk about consensus and deliberation in deliberative democracy theory, democratic theory, it doesn't quite get. But deliberative theorists tend to get terrified by any potential for conformity coming out of deliberation towards consensus. Now, the reality is that in these kind of assembly cultures like the Athenian one, there was always a balance being struck between sustained debate, in which everybody had to say their thing, and in fact there was also kind of a normative expectation that somebody would play devil's advocate, and the fact that at the end of the day, if you were losing out and there was a consensus forming, it was kind of bad form. Just keep going in your own way. That was not really done. Even the kind of the vote by, in the anarchist tradition, that's kind of a very typical argument made. But in Athens, all votes on political decision were made by show of hands, so they were open vote. And open vote has certain features that come with it towards consensus, mainly the fact that open vote is not necessarily simultaneous, which means that when you call for a vote, you can look around and see where it's going, and see what your uncle is voting, and what that guy and what your neighbor is voting, and all that kind of thing. And you can have some kind of causal influence on one another. And also, so I think to a certain extent, deliberation towards consensus in Athenian democracy, like in many of these kind of communities, on the one hand, creates community that can be and can try to be cohesive behind certain measures, but on the other hand, does try to avoid extreme forms of dissent. And the fact is that in a context of Athenian democracy and in the context of these cities, one of the normative values that they always talk about, they even divinize it at a certain point, is the value of homonoia, which means consensus, means thinking the same thing or thinking similarly. Now, homonoia is usually opposed to stasis, to civil strife, to civil war. And the fact is that in this community there was a certain kind of fear that the division of the vote, if repeated over time, would turn into the division of civil strife and of people starting to kill each other. So I think to a certain extent, consensual and deliberative practices, as they were embedded and became part of kind of a deliberative and consensual ethos of how these institutions were meant to work, also serve to create a requirement for a certain level of conformity from certain elites. They had to show that they were part of the demos and that they aligned themselves. And we have examples of that. We have kind of elite politicians that speak for hours against something, but when they see they lose, they even move from the you as the pronoun to us, and they kind of embrace the decision and then start arguing about, okay, how we're going to do this well. Like, we see that working in practice in the debates we know of.
Interesting. Yeah, it's I mean, it's something that which is missing for me in this account of democracy that Graeber provides in this particular essay is of course the concept of stasis, the idea of agonistic competition, not simply building a consensus but engaging into an agonistic competition. That's why I'm asking about the class divisions, because it's just difficult for me to imagine, this democracy. This is something actually that Graeber himself criticizes, this democracy of university professors, who believe that democracy works like an academic seminar. Whereas in reality, of course, there is a lot of room for active engagement and conflict. So I'll probably ask two more questions, and then we will definitely asking for relatively short answers, and then we'll move on to Q&A. I already see people have questions to ask. So I wonder, what do you make of Graeber's methodology? In this essay, he suggests that, quote, one can write the history of democracy in two very different ways. Either one can write a history of the word democracy, beginning with ancient Athens, or one can write a history of the sort of egalitarian decision-making procedures that in Athens came to be referred to as democratic. So that is, of course, his general approach that he applies also to other phenomena. Most notably, he speaks of the states where many historians of modernity would consider it anachronistic, like 5,000 years ago. And, well, for instance, Castoriadis, who was, of course, a theorist of radical democracy and one of Graeber's main inspirations in this essay, Castoriadis strongly believed that we should follow the concept. And he criticized contemporary liberal democracies for not living up to the ideals of Athenian democracy. What do you think about Graeber's approach here?
One thing that always puzzled me a bit about the essay, and at some point I will actually do some research on that specifically, is that he makes the argument that the need by elites that were invested in a republican and fundamentally state-based and elitarian form of governance to start calling their regime democracy was originating from below, because democracy was something people were talking about. And I've always kind of wondered, and of course it was also based on wider practices that were emerging in certain places, but I think kind of that's two slightly different things. I mean, yeah, of course there were practices, but he also makes the point, in the Democracy Project, he's got this wonderful paragraph in which he points out, and that's actually correct, that in the 18th century and the early 19th century, before the American Republic started being called a democracy, to talk about somebody as democratic was mainly to talk about somebody that would talk back to people in authority, about traders and craftsmen and farmers that would dare to speak to the social better as they were equal and stuff like that, no? And this is this sense that then forces them to kind of adopt the name. But of course the name is a Greek name. And I've always kind of wondered, like, where did the farmers get it from? I mean, yeah, they got it from a variety of places. They got a sense of their own rights and a sense of different forms of deliberation. But why did they kind of went to democratia? Where is the classical reception element there? If it's not elite-based, were they adopting or appropriating something that they saw being used against them on a daily basis to talk about what the regime should not become? And that in turn forced them. So I think that's an interesting question. I do, in a certain sense, I am in fact more comfortable. I am quite comfortable with Graeber's approach to the extent that he says we should talk about different kinds of communal governance, or to this kind of democracy, just kind of as a form of deciding things together and being together, regardless of following the word itself. And I think you could make a good argument for Athenian democracy to have a nice place into that kind of narrative as an example of that. And in fact, it would still have a remarkable place because it has the big advantage of being, well, of having an enormous evidence base. It's very well attested, and Greek democracy even more. And we're talking about kind of, I mean, that's why I'm a Greek historian. I mean, the world of the Greek city-states is this wonderful sandbox of 1,500 independent autonomous cities, most of which at some point became democratic, which tried things out. And most of these places are very well attested. We have inscriptions, we have writing from these people, we can follow them over 500 to 600 years quite well. So for pre-modern societies, that's almost unparalleled. So it would still have a place in that kind of narrative. And in fact, for a big chunk of the most famous period of Athenian democracy, the argument could be made that nobody was calling it democracy, even in Greece. They were calling it something else. So even the history of Athenian democracy is not exactly the history of that word. It only becomes the history of that word after a while. At the same time, though, I do think there is a certain kind of paradoxical potential in using the Western democracy narrative and this connection with Athens and the link with this kind of word against itself. Precisely because so much stock has been put into this particular experiment as an antecedent, if it can be shown and proven that this was not quite as they made it out to be, but in fact is closer to Occupy Wall Street assemblies or the Zapatista movement in certain ways, from a rhetorical, political, and even ideological point of view, that has a certain strength. We talk within a tradition, and we talk with people that are within that tradition. So even from that point of view, Athenian democracy can be quite useful, I think, to us, if we can use these approaches to challenge dominant Western continuity ideals and to shake this stuff up. All histories of democracy start with Athens. So what if Athens was nothing like they make it out to be? What happens to the rest?
Yeah, so we have a lot to learn from Greek, from the Greeks, not only Athenians, even by Graeber standards. Okay, well, that brings me to my last question, I guess. That goes back to Graeber's point about the non-existence of the West. I find it interesting that Graeber decided to make this argument through the lens of democracy, because he could very well have chosen many other concepts. But he chose to challenge the connection between democracy and the West. So do you believe that the fate of democracy is tied to the concept of the West? And one reason I am asking this, among others, is because if you listen closely to someone like the American president-elect, Trump, he almost never speaks of the West. Probably he read his Graeber, I don't know. So he probably doesn't see much in common between the US and what would we call the rest of the West. We will see, of course, if he indeed tries to dismantle the institutions of the so-called West. But my question is, do you think that would be good for democracy? Could it actually help reinvigorating, if there's actually, sort of decay, like forced decay of the West? Could it help reinvigorating the democratic project with more substantive democratic practices and principles?
Yeah, that's interesting. Funny thing is that, I was saying that I first read this essay in the Italian translation, and in Italian translation is actually called Critica della democrazia occidentale. So, a critique of Western democracy. So, there's still the West, but it's not right there, as if it's. But yeah, I do feel okay. So we're moving from kind of area expertise to kind of opinion. I do feel that the identification of certain contexts of anti-authoritarian governance from the law with a certain tradition, whether it's correct or not, which is the Western one, is a very kind of comfortable way for people to just cut themselves out. I think if you are genuinely democratic, it's the same happens if you think about kind of concept like the rights of man or human rights and stuff like that. Western enthusiasts insist that this is a distinctly Western concept, and then you get, I don't know, the Chinese government that has been insisting for 30 years that therefore this stuff is Western and is a form of Western imperialism, and we don't care about this stuff because it's been imposed. And then you've got other people that say, well, all communities formulate claims and formulate their own concept of rights. There's nothing particularly Western about this. So I do think that even kind of strategically, if you believe something, I think when we talk about this concept, democracy or rights and so on, as specifically Western, what we are trying to defend is the West and not democracy or rights. And I think if we really care about democracy or rights or all this kind of stuff, we have all to gain to try to disentangle it with what is a problematic concept and also a very specific kind of tradition that has a lot of problems with it and has been associated with a form of imperialism and colonialism and the like. I do kind of like Graeber's take, and I think I'm quite pleased that even in my discipline, which has long been kind of at the very basis of Western civilization courses and stuff like that, we are starting to problematize that stuff because it doesn't help anybody.
Good, thank you. I see people are looking for like more close discussion of the text, and we welcome, of course, the questions or like specific about specific paragraphs of the text. Clearly, we cannot cover it. I mean, that's a huge and very rich text. We cannot cover it in 60 minutes, but your questions are very welcome. Please, so I see Michael's hand, but then there was a question on the chat from Nika. So first Michael, then Nika.
So I just want to comment on maybe some of the practical issues in democracy. And obviously, like from the vast variety of David's writings, he raises this issue of what we kind of call democracy. Many people didn't necessarily use this word, which is after all a Greek word, but even in the discussions of by David Graeber and David Wengrow about ancient cities, they speculate about democracy and then cross that with modern anthropology to say, what is it if you have a group of people that are live together and work together and they need to create common things like water, food, all these kinds of things, or entertainment, they have to, but they don't have coercion, right? There's no coercion that says, right, we're going to make a decision, and once the decision's made, if you don't agree, we're going to coerce you into it. Then what they have is we're going to work together. So they have to build a collective decision together. Yeah. This is particularly true of small communities. David talks about it in his ethnography of Madagascar. People in Madagascar, that they've got to come up with a decision. Yeah. And it's actually really a practical issue. Consensus is a practical issue that if you create a situation where half of the people are really pissed off and don't like it, or you create a situation like in parliamentary procedure where this is my motion and I am going to win this motion and push the other team out, right? That's all fine for a group of elites who are going to then order someone else to do their work. But if you're all going to do it together, the worst thing you want is to have the common task have 49% of the people say, well, fuck off, I'm not going to do it then, right? So that kind of practical issue of consensus. So it doesn't really just surprise me that ancient Greece has a lot of this, well, we're not going to have a lot of coercion. So the practical issue is we pretty much got to come up with an agreement. And maybe if you have this large-scale democracy at this scale, they actually did voting. Remember, David Graeber kind of claimed that most real democracy was about debate there wasn't, and coming to a consensus, but voting was really what you did in a military group. Because if you had an argument in a military group and people were going to go to the sword, you kind of could put it to a vote and say, well, look, there's more of them, we're going to lose, so we'll just go with what it is, and that will be our decision. So those kind of dynamics. And then, of course, the entire argument of Graeber seems to be more about the myth of democracy, the myth of the West being associated with democracy. And this is in some ways what I think is maybe missing from this. But I was really excited to hear the empirical kind of take on ancient Athens. And it's always interesting to say when you take a theory and then the person that made the theory doesn't have all the empirical details, later some of these empirical details come out, will that theory work? And I think when you start to look at the details of how it is that consensus is described, in some ways, David Graeber is really arguing democracy is a bit of a scam, but we need politically to use that word, because if you say you're anti-democratic within the West, people just don't know how to deal with that, right? So remember, who was it? Joseph Schumpeter, as an economist, said democracy was the key form of decision-making for capitalism, because you pretty much needed that kind of consensus decision for the nation to decide which economic leaders were going to make the political decisions. It still wasn't like what we would call a bottom-up democracy, the capitalist democracy. And that's kind of where maybe we need more thinking about the myth of the West, as that capitalist democracy is the same thing as the ideal of democracy that somehow is still connected to ancient Greece, but was also present in countries all over the world, some of them before written history.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Mirko, I got anything to?
Just to say that, like, just the point about coercion and about the military group. Yes, for example, that's one thing that I don't entirely buy about the essay. I mean, I don't buy it about Athens, but also I don't entirely buy that kind of distinction. I mean, first of all, like in most Greek cities, which is the main model he uses for this kind of stuff, people did not bear arms in assemblies, and it had not been done for centuries by the classical period. But also, paradoxically, he at some point mentions the anabasis of Xenophon and kind of an army voting as a kind of, in a democratic way. The funny thing about the example of that assembly, it is a group of Greeks, mercenary, that find themselves stuck in Anatolia, in the middle of Turkey, because the Persian pretendant that they were trying to support is being killed, so they have no job to do and they try to get back. They have no chain of command whatsoever. They come from a variety of different cities. They are soldiers, of course, and what they do to make decisions, they start basically doing what they did at home. They start running an assembly and making decisions. And in fact, the decisions they make are consensual. They're not majoritarian. Swords or not, they just decide as they would at home. And just another small point, another thing that I find interesting is that in most kind of smaller assembly, as Graeber says, of course, you wouldn't vote at all. The interesting thing is that also in the Greek world, and that's kind of often lost, like there was a level of deliberation and of decision making in smaller community, in smaller group that was fundamentally like similar to what he's talking about. And that's where people were socializing, knowing how to run even bigger assemblies. What is interesting and distinctive is, of course, that this is a big place and they managed to scale it up all the way to assemblies of thousands and thousands of people. But that we could talk about that for ages. I mean, like how much stateness you're allowed before you lose this stuff. You can no longer do that. And that goes together with the kind of debate about this kind of politics, how much stateness they had. But yeah, I thought that was excellent points. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So Niga had a point. Niga, I wonder if you would like to ask the question or let me just read it.
Yeah, I don't know. It's okay. You can read it.
Yeah, I read it now. The key question is what decisions need to be made together and what decisions can be left to the people. How the whole system of power in society is organized. It means facilitate curiosity over decision making, because the finite set of choices of decision making is unmooring us. So keeping us from us. So the key question is what are the decisions to be left to, if I get it correctly, what are the decisions to be left to this
Yeah, maybe I
collective,
can. Maybe I can
collective decision making
yeah.
mechanism, and what are the others that don't need that? Do I
Maybe
get it correct?
I will, yeah, maybe I will formulate it myself. I think Michael, I will continue what Michael was asking. So if David's experience in occupying this assemblies, so people were assembling because they were doing the direct action. So you either participate or you walk away. Consensus is a natural thing to do. There is no police who will force you to to go to the protest movements. But in Greece there was like a slavery society. The cities were fighting with each other. So when we talk about this specific example, what this assembly was about, it reflects the whole structure. And there was other societies that describe and dawn of everything. In Madagascar, for example, when governments walk away and then the people decided about their daily life. And then in this case, the consensus exactly the only tool that would be implemented. So that's, I think, the crucial question about democracy, how we use it.
Yeah, gosh. Yeah, thank you for that. Okay, so I mean, the thing I find striking, and that's kind of a slight, so even in the dawn of everything, in the big kind of 60 pages chapter about these kind of forms that he reconstructs, what you do have there is that a lot of the communities of society is talking about still kind of have an in-group and an out-group. And that is the problem about many of these traditional societies, and it was certainly the problem with Athens, that these kind of decision-making processes were essentially egalitarian, open, even to people from different socioeconomic groups and so on, but also they were still limited to the members of the in-group. And there were people that were not part of the in-group, and decisions were made for them. Like the problem with the Greek world and with Greek cities and with this kind of pre-modern society, in some cases and not in others, but certainly in the Greek one, is of course slaves and women. And then the question you need to ask is whether you think the form of decision-making that they implemented was possible only because they had slaves. That has been an argument that has been made. These people were people with leisure because the slaves were working for them. They were not. Most of these people worked side by side with the slaves. But still, that's kind of a long-standing argument, no? In a sense, David Graeber's work shows that, in fact, these kind of models of decision-making are not dependent on people being out, but still there is the problem of the exclusion. The question that you were asking about what decisions need to be made by consensus, the experience in the alternative globalization movement, and that's what kind of what David Graeber writes many times, is that not everything has to be decided communitarily by consensus. There are a lot of things that people can just do, and there are a lot of things the small community can just do. And I think that's true across the board, including in Athens. Athens has village community, has got deems, has got private association. All of them make their own decision. People can basically do everything that is not forbidden. That's the extent to it. That's what we're talking about here. So these kind of decision-making processes do not entail the fact that there is a totalizing need for the community to express a shared opinion about everything. The community expresses a shared opinion on whatever the community thinks they need to express a shared opinion, but on most things they don't. And people just do their own thing. So I think that would be the short answer.
Yeah, that's an important point. Just because the obsession with voting leads us often to ask the questions that not worth to be asked. Stas would be next, and probably the last question. I don't know if we have time for more. Stas, please.
Hi, hello. So I wanted to take us into that zones of imagination back, but I would like to make it as concrete as possible. So I'll start a little bit nebulous. When David writes his accounts of Kayapo society, he notes that there is a practice called moiety. Exists in many societies, moiety, when you always live in a society which has two political groups. Every complete society has to have two political groups, highest level of division, and there is certain institutions based around that, how you resolve conflicts and so on. But at the same time, all the actively existing societies which declare themselves to be moiety societies don't do moiety properly. They say that it is ideal form. This is how properly constituted society should work, village, tribe, whatever. But for some reason, we don't do it properly because we can't work out some conflicts and so on. So this is one angle that is, we have imagination about properly constituted society, and the actually existing thing on the ground, which is different, and it is trying to, it holds this ideal image as something to judge itself as being more or less appropriate. So when Mirko points out that Athenian society isn't really a majoritarian society for most of the case, but we still do have majoritarian decisions, and in our history, in our imagination, it absolutely is majoritarian society. Are we seeing the same kind of a divide as ideal, proper form of organization and contingent active form that should properly be striving towards ideal? And as a more concrete realization of this divide, there are political projects. One of them is Richard Wolff, but it's not specifically right. It's a wider argument. Political project to mobilize people to demand democracy at a workplace by showing that, well, why is it you demand one person, one vote democracy on a state level, but you accept one share, one vote democracy on in a workplace? Why don't you demand the same kind of democracy? And this seems to be an effective tool in mobilizing people. So even though it doesn't even work in what is held up is a mirror, but still our imagination is effective in mobilizing it. Are we actually imagine that a proper society should be majoritarian one? That's a question.
Okay, so, right. So the question, I guess, is, on the one hand, if this kind of model of consensus reached in various societies, including the Athenian one, was just kind of an ideal, and then if the fact that majority still happen, well, I mean, not just majority happen, I mean, civil strife happen. Like, the interesting thing to me, to this extent, I mean, I see that Nika just wrote there on the chat, I would like to find a way to make decisions by consensus in communities larger than 30 people. I think, to an extent, that's precisely why I think a place like Athens is interesting, because this is a place that most of the time managed to make decisions by consensus among 30 people, among 100 people, among 500 people, and among 6,000 people and 8,000 people. And they did kind of consistently. Not all the time, and sometimes the community broke down and they killed each other. But over a period of a few centuries, most of the time that worked out. But then that kind of begs the question we're asking. I mean, what kind of level of cohesion a priori you need to make? What kind of level of cultural homogeneity you need to make that possible if you don't have coercion and stuff like that? I mean, that was certainly always kind of my experience as an activist. I mean, consensus was all good and well until it wasn't. And of course, people at some point would just leave. And some people decided that the consensus was not kind of to their liking and they would just go away. And of course, you couldn't keep them there. But so my worry, but it's not much of a worry, it's just something that as a historian, because I'm not a theorist primarily, the impression I always get is that coercion does not need to be the threat of violence necessarily, but there is a certain level of coercion due to geographical conditions, to the fact that you're a community together, and you need a certain level of cohesion a priori, that is at least some kind of basic agreement on values, on what you're trying to achieve. You need to decide at least a priori that you are a community. Certainly the Greek cities did. They decided we are the demos and that kind of thing. So to go back, I mean, I like my approach to this is very pragmatic. I am interested in how they may do, and I do think that what the Greek city brings to this debate in a way is an example of the dynamic that David has explored so well that still work at a significantly high level of complexity, even economic complexity, and even high level of kind of social complexity and class complexity and all of that. You don't need to be 30 people around the fire for that to work. You can be thousands of people in the commercial hub of the Western Mediterranean, in a city that is incredibly rich and stuff like that. And there's still kind of historical example of decision being made like that.
Yeah, Nika says that seems that majoritarian democracy is only required when people plan something like war or direct violence. I see one last hand from Stefanos. Mirko, if you have just a few minutes, we can probably take this last one, but please make it short.
The kids are in bed, so I'm
Thank you.
All night.
Hi, and thanks a lot for the very interesting discussion. I just wanted to ask something, because you're a professor on that field. The term city-state that is being used, I thought that state was like the carriage of violence and was introduced by Aeschylus or Omiros and not by Aristotle. So it's like the city-state was a view of the most modern, like the modern view of the older cities. So it's not an accurate term. And I think that also Cornelius Castoriadis wrote extensively about the use of that term. Yeah. I just want your opinion on that. Yeah. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, there's no ancient word to mean there's no Greek word certainly to mean state. I said city-state just because I use it as a stock translation of polis, because that's how most people met it in school when they did. But there is a debate on the level of stateness. I mean, I always I use polis, making an assumption that everybody knows what I mean when I say polis, because it's kind of the Greek term and it's kind of widespread. But I do remember once talking to a group of friends and activists, and I was mentioning the polis, and they thought I was talking about the police, and somebody shouted at me, fuck the police at some point, which I thought, fair enough. I think I feel like that very often in my own work. But so that was kind of a way to use what people may have heard. But city-state is the stock translation, but it's problematic too. In fact, people kind of disagree even about that. Is he a city-state? Is he a citizen state? And they don't problematize the state part of it. Again, state is a charged term in Graeber because of his anarchy perspective, and he talks about state in a particular way. But of course, there have been kind of theories of stateness that have a more gradual kind of approach to levels of institutionalization, a progressive institutionalization that talk about stateness and Staatlichkeit and this kind of thing. What you do certainly have in this context is urban centers holding countrysides of varying size with very, very high level of institutionalization and formalization. And that's as far as I would go in a way. And you can call it whatever you want in a way.
Interestingly, Graeber himself acknowledges that Athens didn't have a well-developed statehood, but that doesn't really bother him when he uses the term regarding the even earlier cases. But that to me adds some confusion, but it also makes the anarchist perspective powerful, and if you look backwards. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Mirko, and thanks everyone. Once again, I didn't expect us to cover the text. It is extremely rich, and I think it's already third discussion on this text, and you could easily do like another 30. And we would join you at least for 15 of them, and that wouldn't be enough. So yeah, let's keep reading. And every time you read this essay, you definitely will find something new. Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming. And I just want to invite you for the next discussion that will be in January. I will just post on the Zoom link, not on the chat. So it will be Michael Hudson. If you don't know it's a legendary person. He is a guy who originally come up with the concept of death. In a way, David rewrote and used heavily his research in his book 5,000 Years of Debt, and he will talk about the essay called Against Economics, and that will be on January the 9th, 8 o'clock London time, first Thursday of the month. Thank you so much, Mirko, and
thank you very much.
Yeah, and hope to see you again in the Graeber Institute.
Come along.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.